As an affiliate partner of the Grattan Institute, we're very interested in thought leadership, particularly in sort of new and innovative areas, and this piece of research is one of them. And so without any more ado, let me introduce Jean Frances Kelly and Peter Breeden, who are launching some new research on tomorrow's suburbs. So I'll just hand over now.
Thank you. You told me about this, didn't you? Sorry. One instruction.
Sorry.
Is it working now? Yes, it is.
Second here.
Welcome. There's probably, we noticed that people were coming up in kind of elevator school or lift house, so we might kind of have
another lift school coming in
a second.
And I'm not holding it close enough to my mouth. Okay.
Oh man. It's practice.
Okay, that's good. We did practice this earlier. I'm not sure that's all me. Anyway, well, we're sitting on cocktail bar stools. We've got microphones very close to our mouths. We're not going to sing. Silly to imagine let's keep going with this. I want also to welcome people who have come from our affiliates, and feel free if your kind of organisation's name is read out to whoop. Urbis. I know there's about 6 Urbis people here. Okay. Stockland. Yay. Lend-Lease. Shy or didn't turn up. SKM. Google. Yay, well done. Ernst & Young.
Sorry, after hours, power saving.
After hours, anything can happen. Arab. This is going up again. Can you hear me without this?
Yes.
Now I do need, Andrew can't hear me. Okay, we are using it for the
podcast.
Yes. All right, let's try this one. No? Oh, it was working earlier, wasn't it? Look, that's how close it is. Okay, yeah. All right, well, we'll just, we're on.
I'll introduce us now. This is Peter Breeden, who's a senior associate at Grattan and who's done a great deal of the work on this report. Peter joined us after working in the Victorian government for a while and studying policy in London and Berlin. And I'm the city's programme director. And really all I want to say about my background is that it was a big mixture of things, which in Britain, where I was originally come from, as a bit of a mongrel background.
But I learned quite soon after arriving in
Australia 8.5 years ago that you don't really use that phrase in a positive sense.
So I've tried to stop using it unsuccessfully, as you can see. We should, Andrew, I think it's really kind of uncomfortable when it's going on and off, so I think we might dispense with them. Yeah. So what we thought we would do this evening is spend about kind of 20-25 minutes talking about the report, and then kind of open it to the floor for questions and try and finish at 7 o'clock. And apparently we're hopefully going to be able to get out of the building downstairs. I'm not even going to mention the audio. Okay, we're going to sort of basically be in conversation, and I thought I'd start with just a kind of a quick sense of what this report is about. It's about making our new suburbs that we're building flexible, so making sure that they can change as the people who live in them change. We're building those new suburbs in Australia at a really rapid rate, actually at a less rapid rate in Sydney than in most other major Australian cities, but that's probably going to change. And those new neighbourhoods, those greenfield areas, and by that we mean where last week there was paddocks and cows, and this week there's kind of houses and homes and people living there and so on. They're going to be the established suburbs of tomorrow. But the residents who live in them 20 or 30 years' time from now will be very different to the residents who live in them today, because demography changes very fast at the local level, and they'll have different needs and preferences. And if the suburbs can't change as the community changes, then they won't be good places to live. We started out kind of going and looking at a lot of greenfield development around Australia, and reading a lot of the literature and talking to a lot of people and so on. And we realised very quickly that there's been a lot of progress in the last kind of 15, 20 years in how we build these new neighbourhoods in Australia. We're much better at getting the bones of the place right, so we tend to have grid streets rather than kind of cul-de-sacs that are less walkable and so on. There's a sense of place in many of these places, which through much better urban design, they're often much more walkable than suburbs used to be in the past. And there's been lots of strides in energy efficiency and water reuse. There's community building goes on. It's more likely that primary schools and services are there at the start. It's very different from kind of 30 or 40 years ago, where you could wait a couple of years for a telephone to come on, and where the roads wouldn't be sealed for years and years. And this was all way before I came to Australia, but I've heard about it. And obviously there are also some issues, kind of delays in infrastructure, some real issues around public transport access and so on. And those issues rightly get quite a lot of attention. But we didn't want to write another report saying, we should sort out these coordination problems and infrastructure delivery because lots of other people are saying it, and so on. But one issue that we came across when we were looking at the characteristics of these areas is that we thought wasn't getting any attention at all, is how flexible what we're building is to change as the needs of their residents change. So that's really what this report is about. And I'll now very naturally turn to Peter and say, so Peter, what do we mean by flexibility?
Thank you, Jane Francis. There's lots of ways to think about the flexibility of new neighbourhoods, and people do it in different ways, but we're really talking about the flexibility to meet the changing needs of changing residents over time. So as the population might age, or families are a greater part of that population at the start maybe, but people move out and people get older, different communities from different places and backgrounds move in. These people have different needs in terms of transport, in terms of the shopping that they do, in terms of the kind of housing preferences that they have, but they still may want to stay in that local area. So that's the kind of flexibility we're talking about. And it comes down to things like what land is used for, how adaptable buildings are, the different kind of resources people can get to. But we always go back to this idea of, is it meeting the needs of residents? Now, one reason we do that is because that's a crucial test of the success or failure of any neighbourhood. But it's also a good measure of whether a neighbourhood or a suburb is adaptable to other changes. So if you can change according to the new housing preferences of a different community over time, or their different transport needs and so on, then you're likely to also be able to change in response to technological changes or to environmental pressures. If you can change your buildings, you can change what land is used for. This has a lot of other benefits, this kind of flexibility.
So the fact that we haven't talked about those other drivers of change a great deal in the report doesn't mean that we don't think they're really important. Where we just didn't have time to cover everything completely. We've learned at Grattan that because we do all of our own work in-house, we've learned that it really kind of pays to focus on a particular issue and try and do that really well than kind of spread ourselves too thin. So why, some other thoughts about why flexibility is important. We pictured a young family moving into a greenfield area, and as developers will tell you, that's kind of often the target kind of group that they have in their heads about building these areas for. And often the primary school is now there. There are lovely parks with great play equipment, and we played in quite a lot of play equipment here, so there's a lot of slippery dips.
OHS again.
Yeah, and so on, and that's great. So we've actually done a really good, we're doing a much better job of addressing the immediate needs of the first set of residents in an area. But the thing with those little kids is that they grow up into teenagers. And then the kind of play parks and the things that are in the neighbourhood become less relevant. And again, if people are keen to stay in the neighbourhood and the jargon is age and place and so on, the neighbourhood over time will become less and less appropriate for their needs. And we found it very interesting to compare two suburbs in Sydney, Auburn and Ryde. Very similar in a lot of ways, subdivided in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They're both kind of equidistant from the centre of the CBD and so on. And when we looked at what had happened to the demographics of those two areas over the last generation, if you like, from 1981 to now, the way the demographics have changed is completely different. So in Auburn, there's been a huge increase in the number of young people there, whereas in Ryde, there's been almost no increase in the number of young people, but a really huge increase in the number of over 65s. Now, there's lots of reasons why that has happened, and I'm sure lots of you guys will know more about it than we do, but the point was that it was completely unpredictable, kind of where, which one would go in which direction. And the needs of those two communities in terms of services and so on are now completely different. In Auburn, they need childcare facilities and primary schools and the kind of recreation facilities that teenagers won't, kind of disdain. If that exists. And then in Auburn, they don't need so many primary schools, but they might need bowling clubs or health services and senior centres and so on. And if those needs kind of aren't met, then it's just, it's a much less good place to live. We were also concerned at the effect of a lack of flexibility to change at the city structure level. If we're building a set of kind of what are now greenfield areas, kind of at that certain kind of distance out of the city, and they're not able to adapt over time as residents' kind of needs change and the needs of the demographics and the broader population continue to change and so on, we're going to have to keep building out, as it were, rather than being able to kind of use those kind of areas as efficiently as otherwise would be possible. And that means that transport infrastructure will be more expensive, it will take longer to get around the city, you still have congestion problems and so on, and you just have a less efficient, less productive city if you're not kind of using what you have well. Then we kind of took a look at whether there had been flexibility in the past. And we looked at the oldest parts of Australian cities. We're not really counting Canberra in this special. Obviously, every Australian city is special, but in some ways, I guess Canberra is the most special of all. The kind of oldest inner areas of our cities, the CBD and the inner suburbs, turned out to have a lot of characteristics which were very adaptable. Now, it's important to point out that this wasn't deliberate, we were just lucky, it just kind of happened to be the case. And what kind of characteristics are those? Well, it's things like, there are a lot of things mixed up all together. So you have residences and little bits of retail and commercial and so on, all mixed up at a very local level. We have the kind of one-off advantage of having brownfield or industrial land that you can use for other things afterwards. And a lot of government-owned property and land that can be kind of used afterwards. There are only going to be so many barangaroos. And a variation in size and type of retail businesses. And obviously everything is very close to each other, so a very high level of connectivity, which is a strong incentive to adapt. And indeed, we did find a lot of land use change, and we'll come back to that in a second because the statistics are really surprising. Now, if you compare the characteristics of greenfield areas that, greenfield development that we're doing just now, it's kind of the opposite. The way that land is used is much more segregated, so you have big chunks of residential land, and then a kind of a centralized retail and commercial part and so on. In the residential, the lots are much more homogeneous and much more uniform, and they have become smaller in size over time, which is a really good thing for affordability, but might be more problematic for kind of flexibility and assembling enough land to do something interesting with afterwards. In those larger centralized retail and commercial areas, you also have quite homogeneous lots, but they're much bigger. And you have, especially the initial town centres, are often a kind of a single ownership, single management kind of a model. The houses now are often built towards the edge of the lot, which is the result of the intersection of those trends about larger houses, although it's now kind of tapered off somewhat, and smaller lots. So people who say we want to kind of move to a greenfield area to enjoy a backyard, maybe don't realise there aren't that many backyards anymore in greenfield developments. And there can be very weak connectivity in some areas with very poor access to other parts of the city. So it was really kind of very different, and that was what concerned us. So we thought we'd better come up with some ideas about what to do about it, and I'll let Peter begin to talk us through those.
Great. So Jane Francis talked about the inner urban areas with these mixed land uses at the local level and the diversity that brought with it in lot sizes and building types and so on. And so one of the interesting things we did was we looked at Melbourne land use in 1951 and in 2005 and looked at all the ways that it had changed in that period. And successful cities and suburbs have this ability to change, and the diversity that local mixed different uses brings with it makes places more resilient, and they can change in more ways. And what we found, I mean, the big statistic, and I only wish the lights would go off for extra emphasis at this point again, was that in that roughly 50-year period, over 1/4 of the area of Melbourne that was built in 1951 had changed land use by 2005. So this meant that residential areas might have turned to business, or industry might have turned to housing, and so on. So this is flexibility in action and change happening.
And I should say we were quite relieved to find that the type of land use that was least likely to have changed was cemeteries. But 7% of cemeteries have changed land use.
Yeah, we worried about our analysis if it said 70, but it was only 7%. So that was encouraging. And what was quite interesting to think about it, if over 1/4 of the city is changing use in that period, I mean, imagine all of the economic activity that represents. Imagine all of the additional housing and all of the businesses and shops where people need them that are generated in that way. And what are the characteristics that have led to this? Well, another one of the measures we looked at is how concentrated different land uses are. So we looked at them, how concentrated they were in 1951. We looked at how concentrated they were in 2005, both in the city as a whole and in these new areas. And the newer the area, the more segregated land uses became. So that, for example, residential land in the suburbs built since the 70s had far fewer land uses within 400 metres of every spot, within 800 metres and within 1.2 kilometres. So you're finding some of the trends that Jane Francis talked about are larger houses on smaller lots, and then you're also finding in terms of land use, much more segregated land use into large swathes of the city. And so this means that there's less opportunities to change. So we thought about what to do. Now, it's not really feasible to go back to having industry intermingled with housing. I mean, people don't want that for very good reasons. So we thought about ways to get around this problem of, particularly in residential areas, the land being fragmented into small pieces, all held by different people, and the lack of those kind of brownfield sites that Jane Francis mentioned earlier, where you can put in a whole new type of housing or offices and so on, because you've got that large piece of land only one person typically owns.
And we had come across this last year as well when we were getting the housing we want, that developers and others were telling us that one of the biggest barriers to having more infill development and providing more housing choice in middle suburbs was the difficulties around fragmentation of ownership and land assembly and so on. And in greenfield areas, it looks like that's just going to get even worse over time.
So we had this idea that we proposed of a joint sale option, where people would buy their house as normal in a new suburb on the edge of the city, but after 25 years, they get an option with their neighbours, if 90% of them agree, to collectively sell their land together. And this gets rid of that barrier to reuse and redevelopment and flexibility that Jane Francis talked about.
Now, I have only been in Australia for 8 years, but I have, of course, seen the castle, which is what people talk to us immediately about this. But we did look at quite a few other options, and so Peter will explain why we chose the joint sale option.
Yeah, it's potentially controversial. Some of my family come from Bonnie Doon, so I know how passionately these issues are felt. But the reason we suggested this is that the alternatives to create that flexibility, if you think about it, we thought about 5, but some of them are to say, well, we'll get government to set aside big swathes of land in these new suburbs and we'll just leave it sort of dormant, and then later on in a few decades when needs have changed, preferences change, we can build then. But of course, that's hugely expensive. And what's going to happen with this land in the meantime? Who's going to maintain it? And then at the end of the period, is the local community really going to be very happy about it turning into land that's used in a different way? Or you could consider other alternatives, like saying we're going to mandate only temporary uses, which again has a lot of costs for residents around there. We're going to ban subdivision. So the report talks about a lot of different alternatives, but this one, which is kind of inspired by the way that in some other countries they redevelop strata housing, where you've got different apartments in one building. We thought that this would be a novel approach, and one that would allow you to get your affordable and large amount of housing at the start, but also create options to change uses in the future.
And of course the option would never come up if the offer wasn't attractive enough. So if the suburb was, kind of turned out still to be quite isolated and there was less of an incentive to adapt, then the land wouldn't be, worth enough to, for somebody to come. So in that case, if it, unless people were going to make over the odds on their house, the option wouldn't even come up. And when people kind of kept saying to us, but what about that, neighbour, that 10% who doesn't want to move and so on? You say, well, you're 9 times more likely to be in the 90% and kind of be wanting that kind of windfall that might come if the land turns out to be really expensive in the future.
So this was a proposal to deal with those small lots in residential areas, but there's also a problem of homogenous lots of the same size in commercial areas. So in a lot of new shopping centres, which are increasingly run by single large ownership or management companies, you often have this big building which is very hard to adapt because of its size, and then it's surrounded often by parking and isolated from the streets around. And research from overseas shows that retail centres and town centres that are integrated into the streets around can grow and change over time. So you can find that the shops might go down the arterial road as the local community grows and they need more different kinds of businesses. And the benefit of that is that if these buildings down these streets can turn into shops or offices over time, it means that there's more opportunities for local businesses to start up that are owned locally and respond to local idiosyncratic needs in ways that buildings in large complexes find it hard to do.
Because if you're sort of wanting to start a business for the first time or a little shop or something, it's pretty daunting to have to go and negotiate with Scotland, for example. Sorry, I just picked on you there. One of our Westfield or one of these calls. But it's sort of much easier if there are kind of small mixed ownership and smaller mixed ownership places close to there. And they can be residences in the first years because there's not going to be the catchment area for a little while. And then we took a look at buildings, and I'm going to look at my watch and encourage you to tell us about the building stuff a wee bit quicker than you might have otherwise.
My passion for adaptable buildings makes this hard, but I'll just give you a very quick overview. So we looked at a lot of characteristics that make buildings able to change, and of course we spend tens of billions of dollars changing them every year. It's very important that it's easy to do so. So we looked at a range of those characteristics that we synthesized out of a whole lot of literature, but the one where there's really enough information about what works and how much things cost is about accessibility for disability. So as people might age and their mobility needs change, making houses that can easily be upgraded, where you can put in ramps, where you can put in handrails and things like that. And there's pretty clear evidence about the costs of those, which are relatively minimal in the context of the overall construction cost at the start, and as much as 22 times cheaper than upgrading later without those early provisions, which are relatively inexpensive. So we've looked around at what's going on, and a lot of practices in greenfield areas are moving towards that level of upgradability for accessibility. And so there's some promising approaches to self-regulation, and we basically say that we should sort of keep an eye on those and make sure they're on track, because they seem to be going in the right direction.
Yeah, so the Livable Housing Australia has kind of set up with a lot of different people involved, including people from companies that people are here from tonight. And so the idea is that self-regulation is fantastic when it works, because you can get there with better innovation and so on along the way. But if it doesn't work, then government should consider mandating it at some point.
And so, we've sort of talked about land uses and lot sizes, also associated land, and talked about at least one important characteristic of flexible buildings. But even if you have extremely flexible buildings and you have diverse mixed land uses and lots of options and diversity, there's still a lot of regulatory barriers that can stand in the way of change. And so one of those that we looked at is zoning, which can be horrendously complex and costly to comply with and also to change. And there's a perception with zoning that once it's laid down at the start, it's there forever, which of course, as the community's needs change in terms of the number of shops they need or the kind of housing they want, if zoning never changes, that really stands in the way of those needs being met. So we proposed there that we have broader mixed-use zones which are simpler. And the other thing we proposed is that these zones should be reviewed regularly across the entire city, because that's been quite successful in a couple of American cities, and it seems sensible after a period, if we propose 25 years, to look again at what land uses are really needed and see if zoning needs to be adjusted accordingly. The other one of the regulatory issues we looked at, which applies directly to these sort of greenfield estates that are being built, is something called restrictive covenants, and as the name suggests, they stop you doing things. So these are part of people's contracts when they buy houses that stipulate what the front of the house might look like, whether you can put a granny flat in the back garden, whether you can build up and so on. And we definitely acknowledge the value that these have at the start, because residents coming in want to know what a street is going to look like before it's built. Developers want to be protected from people changing the plan at the start and changing the look and feel of what they're trying to develop. However, those benefits, while they're important, they really diminish over time. So we argue that after 15 years, all of these new covenants should just be phased out so that people can change their housing as they may need to.
And we're not talking about things that sometimes are environmental related covenants on things for very good reasons. And we're not talking about things like that, but things about this sort of restrict people from doing what they would like to do with their land later on. And again, just quickly looking at what, I'm going to encourage Peter to tell us even more quickly about the connectivity, the last thing that we kind of speak about, which is this kind of sense that if places are isolated and you can't get to places very easily, there'll be much less incentive to adapt them over time.
That's right. So people being able to get to a broad mix of jobs and goods and services in itself makes a suburb more adaptable, because if you need aged care instead of a school and you can get to a lot of different kinds of services, then you can adapt to those changes. But the other thing it does is it increases land value. But I mean, to cut a medium-sized story very short, the way we measure this access, connectivity to goods, services and jobs is often relatively crude. You know, how close are you to a bus stop is not a great sense of what you can actually get to that you need in your life. So we've looked around Australia and there's some exciting new emerging measures that look at how long it actually takes you to get to a whole mix of these really important resources. So it's being trialled in Queensland, and we'd like to see that used much more broadly, both in planning new suburbs, but also as a publicly available tool so people can actually know when they're thinking about where they live, what kind of access level they think they need, and they can be much more informed about it.
So these are the kind of practical suggestions that we've made that very deliberately don't cost residents too much today and don't look at trying to change too much today, but which free up options for the future. And that's what our report has been aiming to do. And I'd love that's it for us, from us. That's kind of really all we've got.
But
most people are probably but we would love some questions, and I would suggest that the microphone goes around, but yeah, no, we're not even going to try. That seems reasonable.
What about sustainability? If you've got a 25-year life on a new residential building, isn't that somewhat curtailing the embodied carbon agenda? And do you then have to design for deconstructibility and modular, demountable? Does that change the whole nature of the type of building that we're talking about?
Those are great big words. The joint sale option is only available in certain parts of the neighbourhood areas. So it's not kind of sort of anywhere, if you like. And the size of the area, we kind of said, I think it was about between 10 and 40 lots, depending on what they were close to and what they weren't. So, kind of what makes sense would be different in each suburb. A lot of the time, the options might not be taken, so it doesn't make sense necessarily to build a 25-year building, if you like. What is it, the average age of a
Yeah, a brick building is 88 years and a timber is 58,
Yes.
according to recent research. So, we spoke to a lot of people who said, oh, well, buildings, the value of buildings goes down, the value of land goes up, so, flexibility is all about just demolishing buildings. But the evidence is that doesn't really happen on a wholesale, suburb-wide basis. And so we actually do need to think about the flexibility of buildings. And some of the things you mentioned, like modularity, is something we feature in our report as well.
Yeah, and if some of those kind of things happened, it would be great, because it would be further innovation, giving more choice, and that people can have for their housing.
And
Hi, Nicole Dennis from ACOM. I thought your case study about Ryde and Auburn was really interesting. I think your analysis of looking at, assessing Sydney in particular, of where it is, was really accurate in terms of the inner, middle and outer suburbs.
We can read that.
That's right. And that, especially, I kind of got the impression from this that trends can only go so far. So what could you suggest is if planning and looking at demographics and that kind of research, I'm a planner, as planners do can only go so far, but we see Auburn and Ryde taking quite different courses for reasons, then as planners, what can you suggest that we should be looking at in our planning?
The kinds of recommendations you make in this report,
Yeah.
and making the suburb flexible, because you have no idea what's going to happen. Wasn't it Niels Bohr who said that forecasting was really difficult, especially about the future? And we also were a bit cheeky about the kind of last 3 editions of the intergenerational report and things, because their estimates are really different in each way. So you absolutely have no chance of predicting what is going to happen. I mean, unless you really kind of whack all sorts of regulation on that will kind of be, sort of very conservative and not allow any change, but even that might be kind of overturned by people in the future who realise that, needs change, and, in sort of like having very kind of conservative regulation, trying to ensure that nothing changes, just, can result in stagnation and our children being priced out of the area they grew up in and all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, adopt our recommendation.
I think, so it wasn't exactly like predicting, but then maybe as part of, yes, I think flexible suburbs is part of it, but maybe more around, asking about governance. How can we then work with communities, in this different way, accepting that maybe a strategic plan was right, even with a 5-year change, we still might not be getting there. What indicators will we be looking at to really then, and in an ongoing way, do the planning?
God, that's not a small question. In 2010, we published a report called Cities Who Decides, which is about decision making in cities and about kind of sort of resident engagement. I would do this, but I basically suggest that all the recommendations that the Grattan Cities programme has ever made are adopted, and then you'll be right. We did talk about, kind of sort of engagement with residents as change happens is always going to be important, because it's much more likely that it will happen. Yeah.
Do you think your recommendations, because they seem to target mainly at new greenfield areas?
Oh, completely a new greenfield area.
Can they be applied retrospectively to some of what were greenfield areas 20, 30 years ago that people might not be so happy about now? Some of them sound like they could be zoning reviews, etc. But
yeah.
What about the other?
Well, the zoning ones definitely, because we sort of say it's a good idea, particularly. I mean, I think that Australian cities at the moment are kind of at a point in their history and size where things could kind of go one way or another. We could actually face up to some of the difficult challenges that come along with growth and make some hard decisions. Or we could sort of pretend it's not happening and just, kind of try to say to people that everybody can have what everybody wants and that there aren't trade-offs in the real world, even though people know that that's not the case or have done since they were about 3. So things like the zoning review across a whole city, I think is a really good idea. They've just done it in New York across all the boroughs, with a lot of resident engagement involved, because in particular when a city is, as I said, as I think many Australian cities are at the moment, when they're at that kind of point where they're sort of growing and they're potentially creaking and so on. And these livability indices are just myths, they're nonsense. They're aimed at kind of highly professional, globally mobile, highly educated professionals. It's like the average economist reader or so on. So we need to kind of ignore the fact that we do very well in those livability indices because they're only about one particular group of residents, and accept that there are kind of big challenges. And we need to kind of figure out, kind of think about the whole city as a system, and when doing that, the zoning review can allow that. One of the issues with the other ones is that the joint sale option, all our recommendations are for the greenfield areas. The joint sale option works when people know that that is going to happen when they buy in the first place. Now, it may be that that the uncertainty will probably be integrated into the price, which might bring the price of those houses down slightly at the start, which from an affordability perspective doesn't sound like too bad a thing. Although if you're a developer, it's more difficult. But if anybody can figure out how to get that kind of little bit of flexibility with no change and at no cost, we would love to hear. But it's more difficult to do that retrospectively because then you really are talking about the hassle. But there might be other mechanisms to try and bring kind of neighbours together if they're. But it's very, very hard at the moment. So it was. That was deliberately one of the reasons we were just talking about greenfield areas. Ditto the covenants.
I guess all the 25 years have to finish at the same time, obviously, so that amalgamation adaptation can happen. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, it would be for contiguous lots, but I was explaining. I'm sorry, this is a Melbourne example. In Melbourne, I apologise for every Sydney example. It's great fun. I'm sorry, this is a Melbourne example, but for those of you who know Caroline Springs, in the northeast of Melbourne, Lend-Lease Delphin at the time has been involved with Caroline Springs for 18 and a half years about now. And so they're still building things in Caroline Springs. But they first started selling parts of Caroline Springs and houses and areas and so on, just sort of 16 years ago. And those initial areas, the character is absolutely set. And so the covenants would already have expired, about a year ago, because they're set, and they're nowhere near where the stuff that's being built now is. So what that means that in Caroline Springs, so it's 20-year development overall, they've got another year there or something, and it means that the covenants will be expiring, kind of as 15 years after whichever part of it was being developed.
I guess I was thinking also if properties sell, they might sell a number of times within that 25-year life.
Yeah.
That covenant would obviously stay with the property.
The joint sale option.
The joint sale option.
Yeah, and people would know that when they were buying.
I understand. So I guess if I've been there for 21 years and to sell it with only 4 years left on that, that would no doubt work its way into the sale.
Yeah, of course. Now, if it didn't look like the land was going to be attractive to a developer, it probably wouldn't affect the price, right? Because you wouldn't have an expectation that in 4 years you're going to get some nice windfall, right? But if it looked like it was very likely that the land was going to be really valuable and people were going to want to do stuff for it, it would probably increase the price of your house because the kind of expectation of the windfall. That's one of the reasons why we like this kind of option, because it does kind of integrate the uncertainty around it into the price, and it can work with the market rather than against it over time.
For those people who exercise this option, presumably they want to remain in the suburb, they presumably will need to find housing for themselves. Do you need provision to allow for increased densification or increasing the size of the suburb?
Yeah, well that's one of the reasons why you need land to change the suburb. 89% of the housing that's being built in these suburbs at the moment is family-sized detached houses. So there's not a lot of housing choice at the moment. I wouldn't necessarily presume that they will want to stay in the suburbs. Some definitely will, but some won't. We're kind of just not all the same, as it were. It's kind of things like this that will exactly kind of hopefully provide over time the kind of housing diversity that people will want. So, for example, some people, not everybody, some people will be keen to downsize when their children leave home and so on. But at the moment, if almost 90% is family-sized detached houses, there's not going to be anything in that area for them to move into. So you need housing choices, essentially.
Someone else is asking a quick question about the mechanic, I haven't read the report, but the mechanics of the option. So who's the option in favour of? Is it some of the original land owner's got an option to buy conditional upon getting agreement of 90% of the owners, or is it some, who holds the option?
I do not, but so I mean, basically the option applies to all of this designated area of the suburb, and if 90% of people agree, the option is in their favour, if you like. So it's of the residents. Of
So
the
they
owners.
can drag along the other 10%.
Yeah.
There's the option. So no one's got an option to buy.
It's an option to sell.
It's an option to sell.
That's
Yeah,
right.
got
And
the
this
option to
is-
sell. Because what the option is really to drag along the other 10%.
And one of the things about being sort of using the market that Jane Francis was talking about, the idea is, as Zoe said, if a compelling offer comes along, then you know there's this potential, and that's what drives it. If you have the other options where you say, we're going to keep this land set aside for X years, that involves predicting when a better use will come along, and so it's actually a very inefficient way to talk about.
Plus, it costs a lot of money and looks. I mean, I've seen this tried in some places, and the land is sometimes just not maintained, right? And so it's really not very attractive. But if you do maintain it and turn it into an attractive park, then residents are quite understandably not going to want to lose that park in 25 years' time. 90% is deliberately high because of the castle. In other places they've kind of tried different levels and so on. So it would have to be a really attractive offer to make 90%.
Just a couple of quick observations, if I can just get away from worrying about the price of housing, which is obviously very engaging. But two bigger issues are written at the back of the report, underlying the report. One's about planning and the other is about technology. And as I work for Cisco, I feel the need to ask a question about technology, otherwise they won't let me back in the building tomorrow. But the planning question seems to me, so what you're saying is that in days gone by when we were doing the old parts of cities, we were very flexible, but we sort of were accidentally flexible. And it strikes me that one of the reasons we were so flexible was that we planned less, or we planned differently. And is that right? And is it therefore something of a challenge in Greenfield to stop over-planning and allow a much greater room for things to just happen, in that kind of sense that strategy and planning is what happened as opposed to what we predict it will be? That's one observation. Is that the lesson we learn from the fact that old parts of cities said, hang on, that's one.
Why don't I do that and then we'll come back to you?
Okay, fine.
And then you can do the technology.
Yeah.
So the planning. Sometimes this conversation seems so black and white. It's kind of like, should we plan or should we not plan? And you're like, plan the right amount, strike a balance between kind of evolution and serendipity and so on. And I know it's like the debate about regulation. It's like is there too much regulation or have no regulation? You're just like, property laws are regulation. It's kind of not that big in itself. I think the answer is to kind of have just about the right amount. I mean, what that is in the eye of the beholder. To an extent, I mean, it sort of can be different in different states because people use different instruments and so on. I think it's also worth keeping in mind that those older suburbs where, I mean, I don't really know nothing about the history of planning to know how much planning there was or wasn't. I mean, Hoddle's grid in Melbourne looks pretty planned to me for a start. But also, I mean, there can be real consequences of just kind of letting stuff happen. Like, there were a lot of slums and big public health problems and all of that kind of stuff that it's good that we no longer have. It's good that if there's a bunch of kids in an area that someone's thought about putting a primary school in and so on. So I think it's kind of a balance. So I'm not for over planning and I'm not for not planning, to make it very clear. Technology, go ahead.
Well, the other observation I make about the report, and I still think it's underdone in the report, is that there's a triangle that emerges in the conversation between connectivity, access and mobility. And if you look in the way the world is now working, the role of technology is completely changing that equation, if that is an equation, the relationship between those three things, completely. Because many of the things we want access to are not actually the local shop. their access to things that we access on these things or at work or whatever. So I don't know. I just think we're at very, very early stages, and my sense is that the report, politely but somewhat dismissively suggests that this stuff is kind of interesting but not really important to these big issues. And whereas I think my contention would be it's more important than perhaps you're allowing, and will become more important in the next 10, 20 years.
I guess we'd argue that the kind of flexibility we're talking about would help in the response to technological changes, which are almost impossible to predict their impact in detail, particularly how it relates to the urban stuff and how things are set up. I mean, one of the points where we look at it is in this case of the retail centres and the town centres, right? And so people say, well, the depth of retail, everything's going online. You might have some small little micro store where you can go and feel the fabric and go home and buy it online. You don't stock anything. But then other people are saying, well, actually, with connectivity and higher fidelity stuff online, you're going to have localized hubs you're going to want to work from. They're going to be near you. But either way, we contend, partly based on a previous report we did, Social Cities, that for the foreseeable future, physical interaction is going to be really important. The latest and best research in Australia shows that so-called unmet internet friends, no offense to our hosts, have no impact on well-being. They're a great way to help you find out about more people to meet and interact with in person. So they're very valuable, but you still need to meet them. And that's where these shopping centres are so important, because they're the best opportunity you have in new suburbs to create a town centre. And that brings with it opportunities for incidental interaction, opportunities to create a sense of unique identity that's associated with place, which is really important to people. So, of course, technology is hugely important, but we'd say if you have flexible town centres that can grow and change in lots of ways, they can respond to whether it's the remote working hub, whether it's a different form of retail, whatever it is, they can respond to it.
And we'll definitely make sure next time that we don't sound dismissive because we're thinking dismissive. It will change a whole bunch of things, in particular the kind of 9 to 5 kind of workday and the great big commutes and all of that kind of stuff. But yeah, as Peter was saying, we're still social animals. We will still want, there will still be gatherings like this that people will want to come to rather than watch the video later and all of that kind of stuff. Because you don't experience the lights going off altogether. People will still need to get around the city. Maybe not kind of all herding kind of at one time and so on. But plus, and once we get our jetpacks finally, I guess we have to land on the roof.
They're being launched this week.
I'm going to take 2 more questions. Yourself and yourself.
Great. My name is Jonathan Buck. I'm an independent artist, designer, and blogger. I wanted to ask, what are you going to do with Westfield developments like Bondi Junction whenever retail is no longer affordable for merchants, and would people just be living there? What does that look like?
Well, it's interesting that, if you look at the kind of shopping centres we propose, where you might have this big anchor tenant, but you might have different kind of buildings along here, that orange of the street can change. If you look at strip shopping centres in the centre of cities, retail's gone through these massive surges and declines before, and there are in all Australian cities, inner suburban shopping strips that have gone completely residential and lost their shopping character, and then they've come back and they've changed. But we'd argue that there's some characteristics of buildings and urban design that make that possible. So a big shopping mall is really hard to turn around for other uses, and that's what they found in America, where the economics of all are very different, but they've had a lot of trouble retrofitting and changing into big box stores. Whereas if you have places that are integrated into streets and you have separate ownership, you can actually be much more flexible, and maybe places can become residential or home offices and go back to retail if that becomes.
And also, nobody has any idea of what's going to happen to retail except that it will probably be quite big, whatever it is. But of course, there's also the sort of the growth of services, like kind of the nail bars that, as you can see, I don't go to, and so on. And again, there is a social aspect to all of this, and people are always going to want to interact, and maybe some of them can become more civic spaces. Or
Thanks.
I suppose that Rod Simpson, I'm reference number 75, with my associate. My question goes to the idea of flexibility, actually, and I'm just wondering whether it is the most appropriate term for all of the great ideas, because really, it's not so much flexibility as displacement on the one hand, and displacement occurs within the city because there's actually recapitalisation of land. And what we had in the past was a variety of land values, actually. Leaving aside the land use, what you had was the interposition of a planning regime which effectively devalued parcels of land like light industrial in the middle of the city. So in fact, it's a policy intervention in the land market more than anything else that then allowed those to be turned over and we can argue about whether it's higher and better use, but essentially it's about displacement. And there's re-intensification, and so if you look at it in terms of the suburb, what we're really talking about is actually putting more houses on the same block of land.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Well, it could be a nursing home. Or
That leads straight into where I was going.
No, we found that people do assume it's like, so you mean for when they want to put the high-rise tower up? And I'm like, who mentioned that?
But I think when you perhaps have dismissed the idea of land banking, I think, well, not dismissed entirely, but in your presentation just now, but there is such a thing called public housing. And seeing these other assets and uses, and for example, tertiary institutions which continue to occupy vast swathes of land and mow the grass at great expense. I mean, there are vast resources of these sorts of institutional land uses which can also intensify over time, which are in fact in public control and ownership. And I'm not suggesting that every public housing estate is something that can be turned into multi-storey, but I'm just wondering whether there's not the possibility of suggesting, again, a policy intervention in essentially creating a variety of land values effectively, which allows very intensification over time.
Well,
and the same goes for car parking lots, for example. I don't think there's one single car parking lot that should be in private ownership, on surface car parking. That should be a public asset that can be turned into whatever at whatever time. When you do the percentages on that, that's actually a hell of a lot of land, all those things combined.
Indeed, okay. Absolutely. One of the reasons that we do our reports is not to kind of try and cover absolutely everything or come up with recommendations that are so clearly the right things to do that people will adopt them immediately, because if we expected that, we would have up in the morning. But is to stimulate exactly the kind of conversation and thinking that is kind of behind your comment. The thing about the language, one of the reasons we use flexibility is because it's a term that people understand. In fact, we used the word adaptability through most of the time that we were using doing the report. But because we speak publicly, what we say at Grattan is that we're trying to kind of influence senior decision makers in a way that can be overheard by the general public. And so we wouldn't have been able to use the words you just used because most people wouldn't have understood them. So we kind of try and pass the granny test as whether my granny would have understood me. She wouldn't have done, but you wouldn't have understood my granny either, because she was with a very thick accent. But no, thank you for your comment. That's really interesting. Is there one more burning comment? No, good. All right. I'm going to bring this to a close and say thank you so much for coming. This is the first time that we've done a launch in Sydney. And so we particularly appreciate you coming out, because we're not going to go home until about 1:45 to midnight tonight. So you've made it worthwhile for us by coming, and it's been fascinating hearing your comments. Now, I believe that everybody has to be out of the building by 7:30. They wanted you to tell us that. So thank you very much.